Eventually, in an almost predictable way, the Japanese planes formed up and flew off to the west, leaving the once neatly manicured mooring mast field smoldering. The Marines had barely had time to catch their collective breath when, at 10 o'clock, almost as a capstone to the complete chaos wreaked by the initial Japanese attack, 7 more planes arrived. The markings, however, were of a more familiar variety, red-centered blue and white stars. The newcomers proved to be a group of Dauntlesses from Enterprise. For the better part of an hour, Lieutenant Wilmer E. Gallagher, executive officer of Scouting Squadron 6, had circled fitfully over the Pacific swells south of Oahu, waiting for the situation there to settle down. At about 9:45, when he had seen that the skies seemed relatively clear of Japanese planes, Gallagher decided rather than face friendly fire over Pearl, he would go to Iwa instead. They had barely stopped on the strip, however, when a Marine ran out to Gallagher's plane and yelled, "For God's sake, get into the air or they'll strafe you too!" Other Enterprise pilots likewise saw ground crews frantically motioning for them to take off immediately. Instructed to take off and stay in the air until the air raid was over, the Enterprise pilots took off and headed for Pearl Harbor. Although all 7 SPDs left Iwa, only 3, Gallagher's, his wingman Ensign William P. West, and Ensign Cleo J. Dobson's, would make it as far as Ford Island. A tremendous volume of anti-aircraft fire over the harbor rose to meet what was thought to be yet another attack. Seeing the reception accorded Gallagher, West, and Dobson, the other 4 pilots, Lieutenant J. G. Hart D. Hilton, and Ensigns Carl T. Fogg, Edwin J. Kroger, and Frederick T. Weber, wheeled around and headed back to Iwa, landing around 10:15, to find a far better reception that time around. Within a matter of minutes, the Marines began rearming and refueling Hilton's, Kroger's, and Weber's SPDs. The Marines discovered that Fogg's Dauntless, though, had taken a hit and had holed a fuel tank, and would require repairs. Although it is unlikely that even one of the Iwa Marines thought so at the time, even as they serviced the Enterprise SPDs, which sat on the landing mat, the Japanese raid on Oahu was over. Vice Admiral Nagumo, already feeling that he had pushed his luck far enough, was eager to get as far away from the waters north of Oahu as soon as possible. At least for the time being, the Marines at Iwa had nothing to fear. Not privy to the musings of Nagumo and his staff, however, Lieutenant Colonel Larkin could only wonder what the Marines would do should the Japanese return. At 10:25 he completed a glum assessment of the situation and forwarded it to Admiral Kimmel. While casualties among the Marines had been light, 2 men had been killed and several wounded, the Japanese had destroyed all bombing, fighting, and transport planes on the ground. Iwa had no radio communications, no power, and only 1 small gas generator in commission. He also informed the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet that he would retain the 4 Enterprise planes at Iwa until further orders. Larkin also notified Wheeler Field Control of the SPDs being held at his field. At 1100, Wheeler called and directed all available planes to rendezvous with a flight of B-17s over Hickam. Lieutenant J. G. Hilton and the 2 ensigns from Bombing Squadron 6, Kroger and Weber, took off at 11:15, and the Marines never heard from them again. Finding no Army planes over Hickam, 2 flights of B-17s and Douglas A-20s had only just departed, the 3 Navy pilots landed at Ford Island. Ensign Fogg's SPD represented the sole naval strike capability at Iwa as the day ended. "They caught us flat-footed," Larkin unabashedly wrote Major General Ross E. Roll of the events of 7 December. Over the next few months, Iwa would serve as the focal point for marine aviation activities on Oahu as the service acquired replacement aircraft and began rebuilding to carry out the mission of standing ready to deploy with the fleet wherever it was required. They're kicking the hell out of Pearl Harbor. Although the Japanese accorded the battleships and air facilities priority as targets for destruction on the morning of 7 December 1941, it was natural that the onslaught touched the Marine barracks at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard as well. Colonel William E. Farthing, Army Air Forces, commanding officer of Hickam Field, thought that he was witnessing some very realistic maneuvers shortly before 800 hours that morning. From his vantage point, virtually next door to the Navy Yard, Farthing watched what proved to be 6 Japanese dive bombers swooping down toward Ford Island. He thought that MAG-21's SB-2Us, or SBDs, were out for an early morning practice hop. I wonder what the Marines are doing to the Navy so early Sunday. Over at the Marine barracks, the officer of the guard, Second Lieutenant Arnold D. Schwartz, after having inspected his sentries, had retired to the officer of the day's room to await breakfast. Stepping out onto the lanai, or patio, at about 7:55 to talk to the field music about morning colors, he noticed several planes diving in the direction of the Naval Air Station. He thought initially that it seemed a bit early for practice bombing, but then saw a flash and heard the resulting explosion that immediately dispelled any illusions he might have held that what he was seeing was merely an exercise. Seeing a plane with red balls on the wings roar by at low level convinced Schwartz that Japanese planes were attacking. Over in the squad room of Barracks B, First Lieutenant Harry F. Noyes, Jr., the range officer for Battery E, 3-inch Anti-Aircraft Group, 3rd Defense Battalion, heard the sound of a loud explosion coming from the direction of the harbor at about 7:50. First assuming that blasting crews were busy, there had been a lot of construction recently, Noyes cocked his ears. The new sound seemed a bit different, more higher-pitched and louder. At that he sprang from his bed, ran across the room, and peered northward just in time to see a dirty column of water rising from the harbor from another explosion and a Japanese plane pulling out of its dive. The plane, bearing red Hinomaru (rising sun insignia) under its wings, left no doubt as to its identity. The explosions likewise awakened Lieutenant Colonel William J. Whaling and Major James Jerry Monahan, who, while Colonel Gilder D. Jackson, commanding officer of the Marine Barracks, was at sea in Indianapolis, CA-35, en route to Johnston Island for tests of Higgins' landing boats, shared his quarters at Pearl Harbor. Shortly after 0800, Whaling rolled over and asked, "Jerry, don't you think the Admiral is a little bit inconsiderate of guests?" Monahan, then also awake, replied, "I'll go down and see about it." Whaling, meanwhile, lingered in bed until more blasts rattled the quarters' windows. Thinking that he had not seen any 5-inch guns emplaced close to the building, and that something was wrong, he got up and walked over to the window that faced the harbor. Looking out, he saw smoke, and turning, remarked, "This thing is so real that I believe that's an oil tank, burning right in front there." Both men then dressed and hurried across the parade ground, where they encountered Lieutenant Colonel Elmer E. Hall, commanding officer of the 2nd Engineer Battalion. "Elmer," Whaling said amiably, "this is a mighty fine show you are putting on. I've never seen anything quite like it." Meanwhile, Schwartz ordered the field music to sound call to arms. Then, running into the officers' section of the mess hall, Schwartz informed the officer of the day, First Lieutenant Cornelius C. Smith, Jr., who had been enjoying a cup of coffee with Marine gunner Floyd McCorkle when the sharp blasts had rocked the building, that the Japanese were attacking. Like Schwartz, they ran out onto the lanai. Standing there speechless, they watched the first enemy planes diving on Ford Island. Marines began to stumble, eyes wide in disbelief, from the barracks. Some were lurching, on the run, into pants and shirts. A few wore only towels. Schwartz then ordered one of the platoon sergeants to roust out the men and get them under cover of the trees outside. Smith, too, then ran outside to the parade ground. As he looked at the rising smoke and the Japanese planes, he doubted those who had derided the Japs as cross-eyed second-rate pilots who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn door. It was enough to turn his stomach. "They're kicking the hell out of Pearl Harbor," he thought. Meanwhile, unable to reach Colonel Harry B. Pickett, the 14th Naval District Marine officer, as well as Colonel Jackson and Captain Samuel R. Shaw, commanding officer of Company A, by telephone, Schwartz sent runners to the officers' respective quarters. He then ordered a non-commissioned officer from the quartermaster department to dispense arms and ammunition. While Schwartz organized the men beneath the trees outside the barracks, Lieutenant Noyes dressed and then drove across the parade ground to Building 277, arriving about 8:05. At the same time, like Schwartz, First Lieutenant James S. O'Halloran, the 3rd Defense Battalion duties officer and commanding officer of Battery F, 3-inch anti-aircraft group, wanted to get in touch with his senior officers. After having had assembly sounded and signaling his men to take cover, O'Halloran ordered Marine Gunner Frederick M. Steinhauser, the Assistant Battalion Communications Officer, to telephone all of the officers who resided outside the reservation and inform them of the attack. In Honolulu, Mustacioed Major Harold C. Roberts, acting commanding officer of the 3rd Defense Battalion, since Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Pepper had accompanied Colonel Jackson to sea in Indianapolis, after taking Steinhauser's call with word of the bombing of Pearl, jumped into his car along with his neighbor, Major Kenneth W. Benner, commanding officer of the 3-inch anti-aircraft group, and the headquarters and service battery of the 3rd Defense Battalion. As Robert's car crept through the heavy traffic toward Pearl, the two officers could see Japanese aircraft flying along the coast. When they reached the Water Street Fish Market, a large crowd of what seemed to be Japanese residents, cheering the Japanese planes, waving to them, and trying to obstruct traffic to Pearl Harbor by pushing parked cars into the street, blocked their way. Meanwhile, as his acting battalion commander was battling his way through Honolulu's congested streets, O'Halloran was organizing his Marines as they poured out of the barracks into groups to break out small arms and machine guns from the various battalion storerooms. After Harry Noyes drove up, O'Halloran told him to do what he could to get the 3-inch guns and fire control equipment, if available, broken out and set up, and then instructed other Marines to get tractors and start hauling guns to the parade ground. Another detail of men hurried off to recover an anti-aircraft director that lay crated and ready for shipment to Midway. Marines continued to stream out into the grounds, having been ordered out of the barracks with their rifles and cartridge belts. They doubled the sentry posts and received instructions to stand ready and armed to deploy in an emergency. Noyes saw some Marines who had not been assigned any task commencing fire on enemy planes, which were considerably out of range. At the main gate of the Navy Yard, the Marines fired at whatever planes came close enough. Sailors from the high-speed mine-layer Sicard, DM-21, en route to their ship, later attested to seeing one Japanese plane shot down by the guards' rifle fire. Tai Sing Lu, who was to have photographed those guards at the new gate, had left Honolulu in a hurry when he heard the sound of explosions and gunfire, and saw the rising columns of smoke. He arrived at the naval reservation without his Graflex, and soon marveled at the cool bravery of the young fighting Marines, who stood their ground under fire, blazing away at enemy planes with rifles while keeping traffic moving. Finally, the more senior officers quartered outside the reservation began showing up. When Colonel Pickett arrived, Lieutenant Schwartz returned to the officer of the day's room and found that Captain Shaw had reached there also. Securing from his position as officer of the guard, Schwartz returned to his 3-inch gun battery being set up near Building 277. Ordering Marines out of the building, he managed to obtain a steel helmet and a pistol each for himself and Lieutenant O'Halloran. Captain Samuel G. Taxis, commanding officer of the 3rd Defense Battalion's 5-inch artillery group, meanwhile witnessed terrific confusion ensuing from his men's effort to obtain ammunition, steel helmets, and other items of equipment. Meanwhile, the comparatively few Marines of Lieutenant Colonels Bert A. Bone's 1st Defense Battalion, most of which garrisoned Wake, Johnston, and Palmyra, made their presence felt. Urged on by Lieutenant Noyes, one detail of men immediately reported to the battalion gun shed and storerooms, and issued rifles and ammunition to all comers, while another detachment worked feverishly assembling machine guns. Navy Yard workmen, enginemen Lokana Kipifu and Oliver Bright, fireman Gerard Williams, and rigger Ernest W. Birch, appeared, looking for some way to help the Marines, who soon put them to work distributing ammunition to the machine gun crews. Soon the Marines at the barracks added the staccato hammering of automatic weapons fire to the general din around them. Meanwhile, other Marines from the 1st Defense Battalion broke out firefighting equipment as shrapnel from exploding anti-aircraft shells began to strike the roof of the barracks and adjacent buildings. At about 8:20, Majors Roberts and Benner reached the Marine barracks just in time to observe the beginning of the Japanese second wave attacks against Pearl. Roberts found that Lieutenant O'Halloran had gotten the 3rd Battalion ready for battle, with 7 50 caliber and 6 30 caliber machine guns set up, and with ammunition belted. Under Captain Harry O. Smith, Jr., commanding officer of Battery H, Machine Gun Group 3rd Defense Battalion, the 3rd's Marine gunners had already claimed 1 Japanese plane shot down. Lieutenant Noyes was, meanwhile, in the process of deploying 7 3-inch guns, 3 on the west end of the parade ground and 4 on the east. Sergeant Major Leland H. Alexander of the Headquarters and Service Battery of the 3rd Defense Battalion suggested to Lieutenant O'Halloran that an armed convoy be organized to secure ammunition for the guns, as none was available in the Navy Yard proper. Roberts gave Alexander permission to put together the requisite trucks, weapons, and men. Lieutenant Colonel Bone had the same idea, and accordingly dispatched a truck at 8:30 to the nearest ammunition dump near Fort Kamehameha. Bone ordered another group of men from the 5-inch battery to the Naval Ammunition Depot at Lueluele, just in case. He hoped that at least one truck would get through the maelstrom of traffic. Marines from the 2nd Engineer Battalion made ammunition runs, as well as provided men and motorcycles for messengers. Meanwhile, Roberts directed Major Benner to have the 3rd Battalion's guns operational before the ammunition trucks returned, and to set the fuses for 1,000 yards, since the guns lacked the necessary height-finding equipment. The makeshift emplacements, however, presented less than ideal firing positions, since the barracks and nearby yard buildings restricted the field of fire, and many of the low-flying planes appeared on the horizon only for an instant. Necessity often being the mother of invention, Roberts devised an impromptu fire control system, stationing a warning section of 8 men, equipped with field glasses, and led by Lieutenant Schwartz, in the center of the parade ground. The spotters were to pass the word to a group of field musics, who, using their instruments, were to sound appropriate warnings. 1 blast meant planes approaching from the north, 2 blasts from the east, and so on. Taking precautions against fires in the temporary wooden barracks, Roberts ordered hoses run out and extinguishers placed in front of them, along with shovels, axes, and buckets of sand, the latter to deal with incendiary bombs. Hose reels and chemical carts placed near the center hydrant near the mess hall, and all possible containers filled with water for both fighting fires and drinking. In addition, he ordered cooks and messmen to prepare coffee and fill every other container on hand with water, and organized riflemen in groups of about 16 to sit on the ground with an officer or non-commissioned officer in charge to direct their fire. He also called for runners from all groups in the battalion, and established his command post at the parade ground's south corner, and ordered the almost 150 civilians who had showed up looking for ways to help out to report to the machine gun storeroom and fill ammunition belts and clean weapons. Among other actions, he also instructed the battalion sergeant major to be ready to safeguard important papers from the headquarters barracks. Prior to Robert's arrival, Lieutenant J.G. William R. Franklin, Dental Corps, U.S.N., the dental officer for the 3rd Defense Battalion's headquarters and service battery, and the only medical officer present, had organized first aid and stretcher parties in the barracks. As the other doctors arrived, Roberts directed them to set up dressing stations at each battalion headquarters and one at sick bay. Elsewhere, Marines vacated one 100-man temporary barracks, the Non-Commissioned Officers Club, and the Post Exchange to ready them for casualties. Parties of Marines also reported to the waterfront area to assist in collecting and transporting casualties from the ships in the harbor to the naval hospital. By the time the Marines had gotten their new fire precautions in place, the Japanese second wave attack was in full swing. Although their pilots selected targets exclusively from among the Pacific Fleet warships, the Marines at the barracks in the Navy Yard still were able to take the Japanese planes, most of which seemed to be coming in from the west and southwest, under fire. While Marines were busily setting up the 3-inch guns, several civilian yard workmen grabbed up rifles and brought their fire to bear upon the enemy, allowing Schwartz's men to continue their work. The Japanese eventually put Major Roberts' ingenious fire control methods, the field musics, to the test. After hearing 4 hearty blasts from the bandsmen, the 50 calibers began hammering out cones of tracer that caught 2 low-flying dive bombers as they pulled out of their runs over Pearl, prompting Roberts' fear that the ships would fire at them, too, and hit the barracks. One valve slanted earthward near what appeared to be either the west end of the lower tank farm or the south end of the Naval Hospital Reservation, while the other, emitting great quantities of smoke, crashed west-southwest of the parade ground. Although the Marines' success against their tormentors must have seemed sweet indeed, a skeptical Captain Taxis thought it more likely that the crews of the 2 valves bagged by the machine gunners had just run out of luck. Most of the firing, in his opinion, had been quite ineffectual, mostly directed at enemy planes far beyond range of the weapons, and merely fired into the air at no target at all. Gunners on board the fleet's warships were faring little better. Almost simultaneously with the dive-bombing attacks, horizontal bombing attacks began. Major Roberts noted that the 18 bombers flew in 2 Vs of 9 planes each in column of Vs, and that they kept a good formation. At least some of those planes appeared to have bombed the battleship Pennsylvania and the destroyers Cassin and Downs in Dry Dock No. 1. In the confusion, however, Roberts probably saw 2 divisions of Kates from Suikaku preparing for their attack runs on Hickam Field. A single division of such planes from Shokaku, meanwhile, attacked the Navy Yard and the Naval Air Station. Well removed from the barracks, Marines assigned to the Navy Yard's fire department rendered invaluable assistance in leading critical firefighting efforts. Heading the department, Sergeant Harold F. Abbott supervised the distribution of the various units and coordinated the flood of volunteers who stepped forward to help. One of Abbott's men, Private First Class Marion M. Milbrandt, with his 1,000-gallon pumper, summoned to the Naval Hospital grounds, found that one of Kaga's Kates, struck by machine-gun fire from the ships moored in the repair basin, had crashed near there. The resulting fire, fed by the crashed plane's gasoline, threatened the facility, but Milbrandt and his crew controlled the blaze. Other Marine firefighters were hard at work alongside Dry Dock No. 1. Pennsylvania had not been the only ship not fully ready for war, since she lay immobile at one end of the dry dock. Downs lay in the dock, undergoing various items of work, while Cassin had been having ordnance alterations at the yard, and thus had none of her 5-inch .38s ready for firing. Both destroyers soon came in for some unwonted attention. as bombs turned the two destroyers into cauldrons of flames and their crews abandoned ship. Two sailors from Downs, meanwhile, sprinted over to the Marine barracks, gunner's mate First Class Michael G. Odetas and gunner's mate Second Class Curtis P. Schultz. After the order to abandon ship had been given, both had, on their own initiative, gone to the Marine barracks to assist in the distribution of arms and ammunition. They soon returned, however, each gunner's mate with a Browning automatic rifle in hand, to do his part in fighting back. Utilizing three of the department's pumpers, meanwhile, the first firefighters from the yard, who included Corporal John Gimson, Privates First Class William M. Brashear, William A. Hopper, Peter Curtices, Frank W. Farrett, Marvin D. Dahlman, and Corporal Milbrandt among them, soon arrived and began to play water on the burning ships. At about 9:15, 4 torpedo warheads on board Downs cooked off and exploded, the concussion tearing the hoses from the hands of the men fighting the blazes and sending fragments everywhere, temporarily forcing all hands to retreat to the nearby road and sprawl there. Knocked flat several times by the explosions, the Marines and other firefighters, which included men from Cassin and Downs and civilian yard workmen, remained on the job. Explosions continued to rack the two destroyers, while subsequent partial flooding of the dock caused Cassin to pivot on her forefoot and heel over onto her sister ship. Working under the direction of Lieutenant William R. Spear, a 57-year-old retired naval officer called to the colors, the firemen were understandably concerned that the oil fires burning in proximity to the two destroyers might drift aft in the partially flooded dry dock and breach the caisson, unleashing a wall of water that would carry Pennsylvania, three of whose 4 propeller shafts had been pulled for overhaul, down upon the burning destroyers. Preparing for that eventuality, Private First Class Don O. Femmer, in charge of the 750-gallon pumper, stood ready should the conflagration spread to the northeast through the dock. Fortunately, circumstances never required Femmer and his men to defend the caisson from fire, but the young private had more than his share of troubles when his pumper broke down at what could have been a critical moment. Undaunted, Femmer made temporary repairs and stood his ground at the caisson throughout the raid. At the opposite end of the dry dock, meanwhile, Private First Class Omar E. Hill fared little better with his 500-gallon pumper. As if the firefighting labors were not arduous enough, a ruptured circulating water line threatened to shut down his fire engine. Holding a rag on the broken line while his comrades raced away to obtain spare parts, Hill kept his pumper in the battle. Meanwhile, firefighters on the west side of the dock succeeded in passing 3 hoses to men on Pennsylvania's forecastle, where they directed blasts of water ahead of the ship and down the starboard side to prevent the burning oil, which resembled a seething cauldron, from drifting aft. A second 500-gallon engine crew, led by Private First Class Dahlman, battled the fires at the southwest end of the dry dock, despite the suffocating, oily, black smoke billowing forth from caisson and Downs. Eventually, by 10:35, the Marines and other volunteers, who included the indomitable Tai Sing Lu, had succeeded in quelling the fires on board caisson. Those on board Downs were put out early that afternoon. More work, however, lay in store for Corporal Milbrandt and his crew. Between 7:55 and 0900, 3 valves had attacked the destroyer Shaw, DD-373, which shared YFD-2 with the little yard tug Sotoyomo. All 3 scored hits. Fires ultimately reached Shaw's forward magazines and triggered an explosion that sent tendrils of smoke into the sky and severed the ship's bow. Several other volunteer units were already battling the blaze with hose carts and 2 350-gallon pumpers sent in from Honolulu. Milbrandt, aided as well by the Pan American Airways fireboat, normally stationed at Pearl City, ultimately succeeded in extinguishing the stricken destroyer's fires. In the meantime, after having pounded the military installations on Oahu for nearly 2 hours, between 9:40 and 10:00, the Japanese planes made their way westward to return to the carrier decks from whence they had arisen. With the respite offered by the enemy's departure (no one knew for sure whether or not they would be back), the marines at last found time to take stock of their situation. Fortunately, the marine barracks lay some distance away from what had interested the Japanese the most, the ships in the harbor proper. Although some shell fragments literally rained at times, the material loss sustained by the barracks was slight. Moreover, it had been American gunfire from the ships in the harbor, rather than bombs from Japanese planes overhead, that had inflicted the damage. At one point that morning a 3-inch anti-aircraft shell crashed through the roof of a storehouse, the only damage sustained by the barracks during the entire attack. Considering the carnage at the fields on Oahu, and especially among the units of the Pacific Fleet, only 4 men of the 3rd Defense Battalion had been wounded. Sergeant Samuel H. Cobb, Jr., of the 3rd Defense Battalion, 3-inch anti-aircraft group, suffered head injuries serious enough to warrant his being transferred to the Naval Hospital for treatment, while Private First Class Jules B. Myron and Private William J. Whitcomb of the Machine Gun Group and Sergeant Leo Hendricks II of the Headquarters and Service Battery suffered less serious injuries. In addition, 2 men sent with the trucks to find ammunition for the 3-inch batteries suffered injuries when they fell off the vehicles. In their subsequent reports, the Defense Battalion and barracks officers declined to single out individuals, noting no outstanding individual behavior during the raid, only the steady discharge of duty expected of Marines. To be sure, great confusion existed, especially at first, but the command quickly settled down to work and showed no more than the usual excitement and no trace of panic or even uneasiness. If anything, the Marines tended to place themselves at risk unnecessarily, as they went about their business coolly, and in many cases in utter disregard of their own safety. Major Roberts recommended that the entire 3rd Defense Battalion be commended for their initiative, coolness under fire, and the alacrity with which they emplaced their guns. Commendations, however, were not the order of the day on 7 December. Although the Japanese had left, the Marines expected them to return and finish the job they had begun. Many Japanese pilots, including Fushida, wanted to do just that. If another attack was to come, there was much to do to prepare for it. As the skies cleared of enemy planes, the Marines at the barracks secured their establishment and took steps to complete the work already begun on the defenses. At 10:30, the 3rd Defense Battalion's Corporal of the Guard moved to the barracks and set the battalion's radio to the Army Information Service frequency, thus enabling them to pass flash messages to all groups. The Marines also distributed gas masks to all hands. The morning and afternoon passed quickly, the men losing track of time. The initial confusion experienced during the opening moments of the raid had by that point given way to at least some semblance of order, as officers and non-coms arrived from leave and began to sort out their commands. At 11:05, the 3rd Defense Battalion's Battery G deployed to makeshift defense positions as an infantry reserve in some ditches dug for building foundations. All of the messmen, many of whom had taken an active hand in the defense of the barracks against the Japanese attack, returned to the 3 general mess halls and opened up an around-the-clock service to all comers, including about 6,000 meals to the civilian workmen of the Navy Yard, a service discontinued only after the food supply at the regular established eating places could be replenished. By 1100, at least some of the 3-inch batteries were emplaced and ready to answer any future Japanese raids. At the north end of the parade ground, the 3rd Defense Battalion's Battery D stood ready for action at 11:35, while another battery, consisting of 3 guns and an anti-aircraft director, the one originally earmarked for Midway, lay at the south end. At 12:20, Major Roberts organized his battalion's strength into 6 task groups. Task Group Number 1 was to double the Navy Yard Guard force, Number 2 was to provide anti-aircraft defense, and Number 3 was to provide machine gun defense. Number 4 was to provide infantry reserve and firefighting crews, Number 5 was to coordinate transportation, and Number 6 was to provide ammunition and equipment, as well as messing and billeting support. By 1300, meanwhile, all the fires in Dry Dock No. 1 had been extinguished, permitting the Marine and civilian firefighters to secure their hard-worked equipment. Although the 2 battered destroyers, Cassin and Downs, appeared to be total losses, those who had battled the blaze could take great satisfaction in knowing that they had not only spared Pennsylvania from serious fire damage, but had also played a major role in saving the dry dock. As Tai-Sing Lu recounted later in his own brand of English, "The Marines of the Fire Department of the Navy Yard are the heroes of the day of December 7, 1941, that saved the Cassin and Downs and USS Pennsylvania in Dry Dock No. 1." Later that afternoon, Battery D's 4 officers and 68 enlisted men, with 4 30-caliber machine guns sent along with them for good measure, moved from the barracks over to Hickam Field to provide the Army installation some measure of anti-aircraft protection. Hickam also benefited from the provision of the 2nd Engineer Battalion's service and equipment. After the attack, the battalion's dump truck and 2 bulldozers lumbered over to the stricken air base to assist in clearing what remained of the bombers that had been parked wingtip to wingtip and filling bomb craters. Around 15:30, a Marine patrol approached Tai-Sing Lu, a familiar figure about the Navy Yard, and asked him to do them a favor. They had had no lunch. Some had had no breakfast because of the events of the day. Going to the garage, Lu rode his bright red putt-putt over to the 3rd Defense Battalion mess hall and related to his old friend, Technical Sergeant Joseph A. Newland, the tale of the hungry Marines. Newland and his messmen prepared ham and chicken sandwiches, and Lu made the rounds of all the posts he could reach. In the afternoon and early evening hours of 7 December, the men received reports that their drinking water was poisoned, and that various points on Oahu were being bombed and/or invaded. In the absence of any real news, such alarming reports, especially when added to the already nervous state of the defenders, only fueled the fear and paranoia prevalent among all ranks and rates. In addition, most of the men were exhausted after their exertions of the morning and afternoon. Dog-tired, many would remain on duty for 36 hours without relief. Drawn, unshaven faces and puffy eyes were common. Tense, expectant, and anxious Marines and sailors at Pearl spent a fitful night on the 7th. It is little wonder that mistakes would be made that would have tragic consequences, especially in the Stygian darkness of that first blacked-out Hawaiian night following the raid. Still some hours away from Oahu, the carrier Enterprise and her air group had been flying searches and patrols throughout the day, in a so far fruitless effort to locate the Japanese carrier force. South of Oahu, one of her pilots spotted what he thought was a Japanese ship, and Enterprise launched a 31-plane strike at 16:42. Nagumo's fleet, however, was homeward bound. While Enterprise recovered the torpedo planes and dive bombers after their fruitless search, she directed the fighters to land at NAS Pearl Harbor. Machine guns on board the battleship Pennsylvania opened fire on the flight as it came for a landing, though, and soon the entire harbor exploded into a fury of gunfire as cones of tracers converged on the incoming Wildcats. 3 of the F-4Fs slanted earthward almost immediately. A 4th crashed a short time later. 2 managed to land at Ford Island. The 3rd Defense Battalion's journalist later recorded that 6 planes with running lights under 400 feet altitude tried Ford Island landings and were machine-gunned. It was a tragic footnote to what had been a terrible day indeed. The Marines at Pearl Harbor had been surprised by the attack that descended upon them. but they rose to the occasion and fought back in the best tradition of the naval service. While the enemy had attacked with tenacity and daring, no less so was the response from the Marines on board the battleships and cruisers, at Iwo mooring mast field, and at the Marine barracks. One can only think that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's worst fears of America's terrible resolve, and that he had awakened a sleeping giant, would have been confirmed if he could have peered into the faces so deeply etched with grim determination of the Marines who had survived the events of that December day in 1941. Pearl Harbor Remembered. Several of the many memoirs in the Marine Corps Oral History Collection are by Marines who were serving at Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, and personally witnessed the Japanese attack. Two such memoirs, one by Lieutenant General Alan Shapley and a second by Brigadier General Samuel R. Shaw, vividly describe the events of that day as they remembered it. General Shapley, a major in December 1941, had been relieved as commander of Arizona's Marine Detachment on the 6th. He recalled, "I was just finishing my breakfast, and I was just about ready to go to my room and get in my baseball uniform to play the Enterprise for the baseball championship of the United States Fleet, when I heard this terrible bang and crash. I thought it was a motor sailor that they had dropped on the fantail, and I ran up there to see what it was all about. When I got up on deck there, the sailors were aligned on the railing there, looking towards Pearl Harbor, and I heard 2 or 3 of them say, 'This is the best damned drill the Army Air Corps ever put on.' Then we saw a destroyer being blown up in the dry dock across the way. The first thing I knew was when the fantail, which was wood, was being splintered when we were being strafed by machine guns. And then there was a little bit of confusion, and I can remember this because they passed the word on ship that all unengaged personnel get below the 3rd deck. You see, in a battleship the 3rd deck is the armored deck, and so, realizing what was going on, this attack and being strafed, the unengaged personnel were ordered below the 3rd deck. That started some people going down the ladders. Then, right after that, the Pennsylvania, which was the flagship of the whole fleet, put up these signals, 'Go to general quarters.' So that meant that the people were going the other way, too. Lieutenant Carleton E. Simonson did quite a job of turning some of the sailors around, and we went up in the Director. On the way up the mainmast tripod, Lieutenant Simonson was killed. He caught a burst through the heart and almost knocked me off the tripod because I was behind him on the ladder, and I boosted him up in the searchlight platform and went in to my Director. And, of course, when I got out there were only 7 or 8 men there, and I thought we were all going to get cooked to death because I couldn't see anything but fire below after a while. I stayed there and watched this whole attack because I had a grandstand seat for that, and then it got pretty hot. Anyway, the wind was blowing from the stern to the stem, and I sent the men down and got those men off. Then I apparently got knocked off or blown off. I was pretty close to shore. There was a dredging pipeline that ran between the ship and Ford Island, and I guess that I was only about 25 yards from the pipeline and 10 yards from Ford Island, and managed to get ashore. I wasn't so much covered with oil. I didn't have any clothes on. The burning fuel oil burnt all my clothes off. I walked up to the airfield, which wasn't very bright of me, because this was still being attacked at first. I wanted to get a machine gun in the administration building, but I couldn't do that. Then I was given a boat cloak from one of my men. It was quite a sight to see 400 or 500 men walking around all burnt, just like charred steak. You could just see their eyes and their mouths. It was terrible. Later I went over to the island and went to the Marine barracks and got some clothes. At the Marine barracks, Captain Samuel R. Shaw, who commanded one of the 2 barracks companies, vividly remembered that Sunday morning as well. The boat guards were in place, and the music was out there, and the old and new officer of the day, and we had a music and a hell of a fine sergeant bugler who had been in Shanghai. He would stand beside the officers of the day, and there came the airplanes, and he looked up and said, "Captain, those are Japanese warplanes." And one of the two of them said, "My God, they are! Sound the call to arms." So the buglers started sounding the call to arms before the first bomb hit. Of course, they had already started taking out the machine guns. They didn't wait for the key in the O.D.'s office. They just broke the door down and hauled out the machine guns, put them in position. Everybody that wasn't involved in that drill grabbed their rifles and ran out in the parade ground and started firing at the airplanes. They must have had several hundred men out there with rifles, and every Japanese plane that was recovered there, or pieces of it, had lots of .30 caliber holes. Somebody was hitting them, machine guns or rifles. Then I remembered. Here we had all these guys on the post who had not been relieved, and they had been posted at 4 o'clock, and some 9 o'clock, 9:30. They not only had not been relieved, but had no chow and no water. So I got hold of the mess sergeant and told him to organize to go round to the posts. They had a depot. At the beginning it was a supply depot. I told him to send a party over there and draw a lot of canteens and make sandwiches, and we'd send water and sandwiches around to the guys on posts until we found out some way to relieve all these guys and get people back. Then he told me that it was fine, except that he didn't have nearly enough messmen. They were all out in the parade ground shooting. I think the second phase of planes came in at that time, and we had a hell of an uproar. End of Part 3. End of Infamous Day, Marines at Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941, by Robert J. Cressman and J. Michael Winger.